90 meters beneath the surface of the Baltic Sea, in water so cold and so black that no sunlight has touched it in 1,000 years, something is lying on the seafloor that should not be there. It is round. It is roughly 60 meters across, wide enough to swallow a football field whole. Its edges are too clean, too deliberate, cut at angles the ocean does not know how to make, and trailing behind it, gouged into the mud like a wound that never closed, runs a straight trench nearly 300 meters long, pointing directly back the way the thing came, as if it fell out of the sky, as if it plowed across the bottom of the world at terrible speed, and then, all at once, stopped dead. For years, the men who found it could not tell you what it was. The scientists who studied the samples could not agree, and the closer anyone got to the truth, the more the truth refused to behave like anything that belonged in a stable, silent, dead flat stretch of northern ocean. This is the story of the Baltic Sea Anomaly, what was really discovered down there, why the ordinary explanations collapsed one by one, and why the people who finally pieced it together say the answer is not a comfort. It is the opposite of a comfort, because if they are right, then the thing on the seafloor is not the frightening part at all. The frightening part is what it tells us about how many others there might be. Let's go back to the beginning, to June of 2011, and to two Swedish men who were not looking for a mystery. They were looking for gold. The Baltic is not a beautiful sea. It is gray and shallow and brackish, half fresh and half salt, hemmed in by cold countries and colder winters. But it is one of the most wreck-haunted bodies of water on Earth. For 1,000 years, ships have sailed these narrow lanes, trading vessels, warships, smugglers running liquor, cargo boats caught in storms, and the Baltic swallowed them by the thousand. And here is the strange gift of this particular sea. Its low salinity and its frigid, oxygen-starved depths mean that the shipworms which devour wooden hulls everywhere else in the world simply cannot survive here. So the wrecks do not rot. They wait. Down in the dark, oak hulls that sank 3 centuries ago sit almost perfectly preserved, their cargo still stacked in the hold, sometimes their crates of wine and their casks of brandy still sealed. To a treasure hunter, the Baltic is a museum with the lights off and no locks on the doors. That was the world Peter Lindberg and Dennis Åsberg lived in. They ran a small outfit called Ocean X, a lean, low-budget salvage team, the kind of operation that survives on a good instinct for where the old shipping routes ran and a willingness to spend long, boring hours dragging a side-scan sonar back and forth across empty seabed. Their business model was simple: find a wreck, find its cargo. If the cargo was old enough and rare enough, a hold full of unopened champagne, say bottles, that would fetch a fortune at auction precisely because they had spent 200 years chilling on the bottom of the Baltic. Then the payday was real. They were not fantasists. They were not monster hunters. They were businessmen with a boat and a sonar rig, hunting for very old, very valuable garbage. So picture the deck that June. The engines low idle, the gulls, the sonar screen glowing in the wheelhouse, painting the seafloor below in slow, grainy sweeps of gray. When you do this for a living, you learn to read that screen the way a doctor reads an X-ray. A soft, blurry return is just mud, sediment, silt, nothing. A hard, solid return means something dense down there, something that reflects the sound back sharp and clean. And a hard return, in the Baltic, almost always means the same thing. Another wreck, another wooden ghost, another possible payday. That day the screen gave them a hard return, and the men leaned in, expecting the familiar long shape of a keel, the ribbed silhouette of a hull lying on its side. That is not what appeared. What crawled onto the screen, sweep by sweep, was round, perfectly, impossibly round, a disk. A circle carved into the bottom of the sea, 60 meters across, its outline sharp enough that for a moment the men on that boat did not speak, because there is nothing you can say to that. Ships are not round. Reefs are not round. The ocean floor does not draw circles. And its edges, the edges were the part that got under the skin, the part that Åsberg would later describe as the thing that made the hair stand up on his arms. They were too clean, too geometric, too precise. Waves and currents and time do not carve straight lines and closed curves. They round things off. They blur and soften and bury. And yet here was a shape that looked less like something the sea had made and more like something the sea had found. Think about what that does to a man's mind. He came out here to make money off dead sailors, and instead his instrument was showing him a shape his instrument was never supposed to show him, a shape with no honest name in his entire professional vocabulary. But it was the second detail that changed everything, because the object did not sit there alone. Running away from it, cut into the seabed, was that trench. Long, straight, deep. Nearly 300 meters of gouged, disturbed seafloor pointing back like an arrow toward the disk. And the moment you saw the trench, your brain did the thing brains do. It filled in the story. This thing had not grown here. It had not settled here, gently over centuries. It had come from somewhere else, moving fast, low, and heavy, dragging its belly across the bottom of the Baltic, tearing that scar into the mud for the length of 3 football fields. And then it had stopped, not slowed, not drifted to rest. Stopped, hard and sudden, the way a thing stops when it hits something. The way an aircraft stops when it comes down out of the sky and skids across a runway it was never meant to reach. Lindberg said it out loud, half as a joke and half not, and the joke would follow the object for the rest of its strange public life. It looked, he said, like a crash landing. And the more they stared at the screen, the disk, the scar, the ruler-straight furrow ending in a wall of clean geometry, the harder that joke became to laugh at. Now here is where you have to slow down and think about what a seabed actually is, because the trench is not just a dramatic detail, it is a physical claim, and physical claims can be tested. The Baltic floor is not stone, it is soft, it is sediment, silt and clay and the slow rain of 1,000 years of dead things drifting down through cold water and settling into a gray, yielding mud. And mud does not keep secrets. Mud is the great forgetter of the ocean. Drag an anchor across it, and within a season the current smooths the wound. Sink a wooden ship into it, and, given enough decades, the sediment climbs the hull, swallows the deck, buries the ribs until only the tops of the timbers still breathe above the silt. This is how the Baltic works. It is a dynamic floor, always shifting, always resettling, always erasing. That is precisely why the wreck hunters love it. The cold, brackish, low-oxygen water preserves the wood, but the moving sediment keeps hiding and revealing, so there is always something new to find. Now hold that fact in your hand and look again at the trench. 300 meters long, sharp-edged, crisp, pointing like a finger. That is a fresh wound in a place that heals fast. And that raised the first genuinely uncomfortable question, not whether the object was strange, but whether it was recent. Because a scar that clean, in mud that soft, should not last. It should soften within months. The walls of the furrow should slump. The current should carry silt into the bottom of it and begin, gently, to fill it in. So the men made a decision that, in hindsight, is the reason this story did not die as a one-day curiosity. They came back. Months later, they returned to the same coordinates, dropped the same sonar, and ran the same sweep across the same patch of the seafloor, expecting, if they were honest with themselves, to see the trench blurred and half erased, the mud already reclaiming it, the whole thing a little less dramatic than the memory they had been carrying around all winter. It was not less dramatic. According to their account, the trench was still there, still sharp, still crisp, still pointing, as though whatever had plowed across that floor had done it not centuries ago, but recently enough that the sea had not yet had time to bury the evidence, or worse, as though the sea had been trying to bury it and could not. And that is where a story like this either finds a serious voice or loses one, because at this point it would have been easy to spiral into pure fantasy, and instead the case picked up its first hard, sober objection from exactly the kind of person you would want in the room, a geologist, someone who reads the bottom of the sea the way you read a page, someone whose entire training is built to say no, that's just a rock, that's just a moraine, that's just glacial scarring, and to say it with authority. The scientist they consulted worked out of a Stockholm university, a specialist in the sediments and stone of exactly this region, and what he told them was not comforting. He explained that the Gulf of Bothnia, the northern reach of the Baltic where this object sat, is not some restless, volcanic, fractured piece of the planet. It is the opposite. It is part of one of the oldest, coldest, most geologically boring shields on Earth, a slab of ancient continental crust so stable that in the long grammar of the planet it barely moves at all. No active faults grinding beneath it, no submarine volcanoes venting heat and rock, nothing down there with the power to seize a 60-meter mass and drag it sideways across the floor in a dead straight line and then set it down. And glaciers, he pointed out, because someone always reaches for glaciers, do not draw straight lines either. When the ice sheets retreated at the end of the last age, they left their marks all over Scandinavia, dragging boulders, gouging valleys, scattering debris. But glacial scarring is chaos. It is random. It is a mess of overlapping scratches pointing in every direction, boulders dumped where the ice happened to drop them, a landscape written in a drunk hand. What it does not do is carve a single ruler-straight furrow 300 meters long and end it in a precise, deliberate arrest, a full stop, a period at the end of a sentence no glacier ever wrote. So the geologist was doing his job. He was reaching for the ordinary explanation, taking it seriously, and then watching it fail on real grounds. And when the two most obvious natural stories, the moving seabed, the retreating ice, both came up short, the men were left holding a shape that the region's own geology could not account for. That should have been the strangest part. It was not. Because on the next expedition, they brought better equipment, upgraded sonar, high-resolution cameras, satellite positioning gear, the full kit of a crew that had decided to stop guessing and start measuring. And it was on that trip that they discovered the thing about the object that no rock, no wreck, no glacial scar has ever done to a boat. The equipment started to die. Not slowly, not one system at a time in a way you could blame on a loose cable or a low battery. All at once. They would motor in toward the coordinates, closing the distance, the instruments running clean and normal. And then, at a certain point, roughly 200 meters out from the object, everything on the boat that depended on a signal simply stopped. The satellite phone went dead. The navigation gear lost its fix. Even the sonar, the instrument that had found the thing in the first place, dropped out, as if the sea beneath them had gone suddenly, deliberately silent. And here is the detail that turned a technical annoyance into something colder. It was repeatable. It had a line. If they held their position inside that 200-meter radius, they stayed blind and mute. If they pulled back, past that invisible boundary, everything switched back on. The phone found its network. The navigation locked its position. The sonar started painting the floor again, as if nothing had happened. In, dead, out, alive, a binary, a switch, a threshold you could cross and recross and watch flip the equipment off and on like a hand moving over a control panel. They started calling it the dead zone. And once you have a name like that for a stretch of open water, you stop coming out here for wooden ships. You start coming out here to understand what could possibly be doing that, because a passing thought had begun to circle the crew, quiet and unwelcome. And it was this: the sea does not turn off telephones. Here is where the geologist's world and the treasure hunter's world began to pull apart, and it is worth slowing down to feel why. Because a scientist, hearing the equipment died, reaches immediately for the boring answer, and the boring answer here has a name: iron. The Baltic seabed is not shy about metal. Sunken hulls rust into the sediment. Ancient deposits carry magnetic minerals, and a strong enough magnetic anomaly can, in principle, tug at a compass needle, throw off a heading, make an old instrument twitch. That is real. That happens. Any mariner who has crossed a field of iron wrecks has watched a compass wander and shrugged it off. But the crew had done exactly that for years. They had sailed over rusting iron wrecks, over the graveyard of a sea that has swallowed more ships than almost any water on Earth. and their compasses had wandered, and their instruments had complained, and never, not once, had a satellite phone gone silent. And that distinction matters more than it sounds. A compass is a passive thing. It listens to the planet's magnetism and points. Iron can lie to a compass because a compass is only ever asking one dumb question. Which way is the pull? A satellite phone is a different animal entirely. It is not listening to the Earth. It is reaching up tens of thousands of kilometers to a machine in orbit and holding a conversation. To kill that conversation across a 200-meter circle of open water, you do not need a lump of magnetic rock. Magnetism does not do that. Magnetism is not loud enough, not in the right language. To silence a signal that is bouncing off a satellite, something has to be actively pushing back, putting out energy of its own, filling that column of water and air with enough interference to drown the conversation out. Passive rock whispers. What the crew was describing shouted. And that is the line the geologist could not comfortably cross, and the crew could not comfortably retreat from. He could explain a nudged compass. He could not explain a 200-meter kill radius with a hard edge you could measure with a stopwatch and a length of rope. Iron-rich rock does not have an off switch. It does not have a threshold. It does not wait for you to cross a line and then reach up and pull the plug on a machine in the sky. So think about what that does to a crew's nerve. You have found a shape the ocean did not carve. You have found a furrow the ice did not gouge. And now you have found a boundary in the water, invisible, silent, exact, that shuts down everything you own the moment you cross it and hands it all back the moment you leave. Every ordinary answer they reached for came apart in their hands, and the space where the answer should have been kept getting louder. They could have stopped there. Plenty would have. You have a story now, a good one, the kind that fills a documentary and sells a book, and you never have to prove anything colder than, "We don't know." But Lindberg and Åsberg were not folklorists. They were men who had spent their lives believing that if you go and look, the sea gives up its secrets. And there was only one way left to look. Someone was going to have to go down there. Understand what that sentence costs. The object sits 90 meters below the surface, and 90 meters in the Baltic is not the warm, blue, forgiving water of a diving postcard. At that depth, the temperature hovers just above freezing, around 2 degrees, cold enough to make your regulator work harder and your hands go clumsy inside the gloves. There is no light. None. Whatever the sun does up top, it does not reach 90 meters. Down there, it is a darkness so complete that your own hand vanishes 6 inches from your mask, and the only world that exists is the small cone your lamp can carve out of the black. And the pressure. At 90 meters, a diver is under roughly 9 atmospheres, 9 times the weight of air you are carrying on your shoulders right now, pressing in from every side. You cannot breathe ordinary air that deep. The nitrogen turns narcotic, and the oxygen itself turns toxic. You breathe a carefully mixed blend, trimix, helium, and oxygen and nitrogen balanced against the depth. And even then, the margin for a mistake is not measured in minutes. It is measured in seconds. A wrong move, a wrong breath, a moment of the confusion that deep water breeds and the sea keeps you. The man who went down was the expedition's lead diver, Stefan Högborn. A professional, someone who had earned the right to be trusted at that depth, someone whose whole training was built on staying calm when the darkness closes and the pressure sings in your ears. He went down on the trimix into the 2 degrees and the 9 atmospheres and the total black, following the line toward a shape that the geology could not explain and the physics could not explain, with the crew above him blind and mute inside the dead zone, unable to phone for help if help were needed. And this is the moment to hold, because everything the men had gathered so far was, in the end, second-hand. A sonar return, a reading on a screen, a needle behaving strangely. It was data. It was inference. Högborn was about to make it flesh. He was about to put a human hand on the thing. The descent itself was a slow, deliberate falling. Down through the layers of the water, the temperature dropping, the light dying by degrees until it did not die but simply ceased, and the pressure building until every joint felt the weight of it. And then, out of the dark below him, the floor. But the floor did not behave. As his lamp found the bottom, the sediment lifted, a fine, silty cloud that his own movement and the object's strange presence stirred into the water, and it did not settle. It hung. It filled the beam of his light until the light itself was useless, a milky glow with nothing to illuminate, and his visibility collapsed to almost nothing. 1 square meter. That was the world now. A single arm's length of murk he could reach into and touch, and beyond it, in every direction, the black and the cold and the crushing weight of the sea. So he did the only thing left to a man who has come this far. He reached out into that 1 square meter of visible water, past the soft mud that his fingers expected, and he felt for the thing itself. And what his hand found where the mud gave way was not soft at all. It was hard, hard in a way that stopped him, that made him pause with his glove flat against it, because the softness of the seabed had promised nothing like this. Beneath the mud, the surface turned to something rigid and pitted, cratered under his fingers like a thing that had been through fire. Not the smooth rounding that water gives a stone over 10,000 years. Pitted, cracked. The texture, he would say afterward, of concrete that had been left too long in a furnace, blistered and scorched and set into a permanence that felt wrong beneath a hand at the bottom of a freezing sea. He moved along it, and the sediment closed behind him and opened before him a foot at a time, so that he was building the shape in his mind piece by blind piece, the way you learn a room in the dark. And what his hand traced next was the thing that undid him, a wall, a flat vertical face rising straight out of the floor, and where it met the bottom, it met it at an angle his fingers could not argue with. 90 degrees. A right angle, clean, sharp, holding at the bottom of a sea whose whole business is to soften and slump and round away every edge the world tries to make. He followed it. He swam along what felt like a corridor, one hand on the wall, and the wall turned and met another wall, and the two of them met at a corner as square as anything cut by a mason. Parallel planes, flawless right angles, repeating. And you have to understand what that means to a man who has spent his life in the water, because erosion is not lazy and it is not partial. It rounds everything, always, given time. And time is the one thing the seabed has in abundance. Edges like these should not survive. They should not be able to exist. And yet his glove found them, one after another, and each one was a small, quiet violence against everything he knew. On the upper surface, near the top of the shape, his light found the last thing, a hole, circular, set inside a raised rim that was not round but squared, a frame around an opening, like a window sunk into a wall, like a hatch, like a port, reinforced and deliberate and turned somewhere along the way into stone. His hands read scorched concrete, his eyes, in the milk of his lamp, read engineering. And those two facts sat in his mind and refused to be the same fact, and could not be pulled apart, and there is no calm training in the world that prepares a man for that at 90 meters with the pressure singing in his skull. He came up, slowly, as he had to, stopping at the depths where the gas in his blood needed time to let go of him, and he brought samples, and the samples went to the geologist's lab, to the man who had told them the shield beneath that sea was among the most stable ground on earth. And the lab looked at what he sent, and the answer came back, and the answer was worse than the mystery. Basalt, igneous rock, the kind of stone that is born only from magma, only from volcanic fire, and there had been no volcanism in that part of the Baltic for tens of millions of years. It was, the comparison goes, like finding a permanent iceberg standing in the middle of the Sahara. The rock was real, and the rock had no business being where it was. Then they put the crystals under an electron microscope, and the microscope found the last thread of the story. The structure of the crystals carried a signature, the mark of stone that had been taken to thousands of degrees and then, in an instant, plunged into cold, furnace heat, re-entry heat. Heat quenched in freezing water so fast the crystals froze mid-scream. They thought of a meteorite, of course, a strike from the sky that could bring heat like that, but they let it go, because impacts do not build corridors. Impacts shatter. They fling out chaotic glass and ruin and randomness, not preserved walls meeting at flawless right angles, not a squared frame around a round hole. So what does that leave? Follow the thread all the way down and it arrives at a single, cold conclusion, that this was never a natural formation at all, that it was a thing made, a structure, a machine, a vehicle of some kind, caught in a catastrophic release of energy so violent it melted the object's own materials, fused them with the mud of the seabed, and petrified the entire shape into stone. The body of it burned away, but the form survived, like a fossil that keeps the outline of a creature long after the creature itself is dust. The blueprint endured while the thing it described was destroyed, a corpse of technology, pressed flat into the record of the earth. And here is where the real horror lives, and it is not in one disk on one seabed. It is in the question that disk forces you to ask. If a made thing can be burned and fused and turned to rock, and lie there for age upon age looking exactly like ordinary geology, looking like nothing at all, looking like the kind of lump on a sonar screen that a treasure hunter groans and steers around, then how many others are there? How many undersea ridges and mounds and formations, catalogued and dismissed and forgotten, are not formations at all? How much of the ocean floor, mapped and unmapped, is quietly a graveyard, a boneyard of technology from we do not know when, disguised as the most boring thing in the world? That is the thought that should keep you up. Not that something is down there. Something is always down there. It is that we may have been sailing over the tombs of the past for centuries and calling them rock because rock is exactly what they were made to become. And the honest truth is that the case is not closed. The dead zone was never fully explained. The trench that refused to heal was never fully accounted for. The basalt that cannot be there is still there. The right angles that cannot survive were touched by a man's hand. Every ordinary answer was weighed, and every ordinary answer left something hanging in the cold and the dark. So let me put it to you. Of everything in this file, the ruler-straight scar behind it, the electronics that all died at once inside 200 meters, the 90-degree walls at the bottom of a sea that softens everything, or the squared frame around that circular hole, which single detail is the one you cannot explain away? Tell me in the comments where you land and why. Because the next case waiting at the edge of the map is darker still.